This is Art Sense, a podcast focused on educating and informing listeners about the past, present, and future of art. I'm Craig Gould. On today's episode, I speak with artist Julian Opie. Opie is an artist known for distilling the world around us into its simplest forms, reducing people, animals, and architecture into shapes and lines that capture their essence instead of their details. In the conversation, we discuss his inspirations, his process, and his new show at Lisson Gallery in London that includes his continued experimentation with virtual reality. And now, a conversation about paring away the superfluous to find the familiar with artist Julian Opie. Julian Opie, thank you so much for joining me this week on the Art Sense podcast. Julian, a lot of times with artists, I like to start with a hypothetical. If you're sitting at a dinner party next to someone who has no idea who Julian Opie is, and you try to describe to them who you are and what your work is, where do you start to describe what you do?
Well, I'm always a little tentative about saying or admitting that I'm an artist. It always sounds like a presumption it's like saying, I don't know, I'm a rocket scientist or something that requires a certain amount of presumption to think that you are, in fact, an artist. I think in a lot of people's minds that in itself is a claim. Of course, it isn't. You can be a terrible artist, just what you spend your time doing. But the next thing I often do is to say that I'm a sculptor, because I feel for people that seems to satisfy some kind of sense of definition. Of course, we know it doesn't really make much difference what you say, and that almost everything can be defined as sculpture if you want to look at it that way. I think I came from sculpture. It makes more sense to me, the idea that you're just making stuff, making things. Quite often they're rectangular panels that hang on the wall and have some amount of paint on them, but I've never really thought of myself as making paintings. That seems to me too specific. And too historic an idea. Paintings have existed for a fairly short amount of time, and even the walls on which they sit on have existed for a fairly short amount of time in the grand scheme of things. So sculpture seems like a good place to start. I often mention that I make animations as well, because I think although the majority of my work probably isn't actually animated, there's a sense of connection to movement that is pretty central to the work, and a lot of it is animated. A lot of the public works I make are animated in the sense that they actually move, and I found that that's a way of engaging people. And if this hypothetical person at the dinner party isn't that involved in the art world, then an animated image is probably something that's more likely to feel approachable. The fact that it moves gives you something to look at, gives you a story immediately without having to think, well, what is that? Or why is that there? Or what does it mean? None of those questions I think are very interesting. More interesting is just like, oh, it's big, or I like that, or I don't like that. That seems like a more interesting response. What else would I tell them? I work on the computer a lot. That seems to define things for people. They want to know whether you actually make something yourself. And there's often a look of slight disappointment when I mention computers, or the fact that I don't actually build things with my hands anymore. I used to. It simply became a lot more efficient to be in a more sort of artistically managerial kind of position, perhaps like an architect who doesn't really want to be laying the bricks, because that would kind of hold you up and hold up the process. And there's a loss in there to a degree. I can see that, but there's also a lot to be gained. Every now and then I plunge back into trying to make something myself, and I'll do it for a bit, but I quite quickly want to withdraw and just design the whole group of next ones and get someone else to actually do the handiwork. What else would I tell them? I work in a studio, in a sort of fairly warehouse workshop type of environment. It's a 19th century studio in London where they used to make furniture. So there's a sort of sense of craft level of activity. I don't run a huge factory, and I don't work in my bedroom. I'm on the sliding scale of those two things. I'm I'm in a sort of a workshop kind of environment. Although, having said that, quite a lot of the projects I do are beyond what we can actually make ourselves. I use factories around the world, in Korea and in London, in order to move away from that domestic kind of scale and to use technologies that are sort of too tedious to either learn or get the machinery that you need to undertake. Do you think that they'd understand any of that, or turn to the other person on the other side?
Right. So in your studio, help me delineate where that line is between what your team can accomplish and what winds up going to a fabricator. Are there like CNC routers and you're able to do paintings and coatings versus shaping? And is it a matter of scale?
Well, to a degree, it's a matter of scale. Obviously, if something's too big to come in the door, you've got to rethink how things are. I do have two studios. I've got a railway arch, which is a kind of phenomenon often used here in London, which allows us, to back a truck in. Mm-hmm. But as I say, my studio proper is a 19th century warehouse, where they have a pulley outside to wheel things up into the air and into double doors. But really, it's more of a sort of domestic kind of level factory type of situation. Really, I approach every project with a sense of wanting to make it in a way that feels appropriate. A way where the meaning plays with the imagery. So that, for instance, I've been making, and I'm showing at the moment, just opened last night, a series of works that are made of high polished stainless steel. Mm-hmm. And the reason for that is that I need round tubing, for one thing. So we're already limited in what can exist as round tubing, because I want to draw in it with a bent line. And round tubing works really rather well for that, because you can twist in any direction. And then I'm looking at tubing in the world and how that kind of bent line tubing exists. And I'm looking at handrails in football stadiums and bike racks on the street that you tie your bike to. And it's for those reasons that I'm looking at what kind of material would be appropriate, rather than what can I do? What am I able physically to make? That seems like a fairly irrelevant question. So the work itself is built out of what I see in the world. And if it's stainless steel tubing, I simply find a stainless steel tubing manufacturer. And we get to work, we get to learning, what can be done, what can't be done. And it's kind of bicycle frame technology. And that's how those works come about. And if I want something to move, I'm looking out in the world at the way that things do move. And I came across in the 80s these early LED arrows in Tokyo, showing you which way to go through a public building. And I thought, okay, that movement. It's so physical. It's so object-like. These little lights moving across the screen. It's not like a TV where it's just like a photograph really that moves. It's an actual kind of moving object. And so I then start to investigate, factories for LEDs, and I now have a network of Chinese and Korean LED producers who make these things for me, and there's really no point in me trying to, build them myself. How would you build an LED anyway? I've got no idea. So no, I don't have routers. I've got a very large Epson printer. It's like your desktop printer, but about 6 foot wide, and that allows me to both make tests of very large things and sometimes actually produce works straight off that. It's archival ink. It's as good as any silkscreen print in a lot of ways. And there's a few hand systems I do use. Painting by hand has a very particular quality, and it also allows for some kinds of mark making that are very difficult to do in any other way. So, for instance, I'm really interested in Egyptian objects, art, and the way that they often made, particularly outdoor imagery, was to carve into the stone and then paint into that carved stone. And that gives, particularly with raking desert sunlight, it gives a kind of shimmering magic to the image. It also means that you can touch up the paint really easily. In the next pharaoh's millennia, you can just go back and paint it again because the carved edges are all there, ready for you to delineate for the craftsperson where to paint, rather than simply a flat surface. So I kind of look at a lot of these Egyptian things and think I'd like to work like that. So, how do you carve stone? I use a kitchen manufacturer just outside London. They carve stone worktops. They make them for me and then bring those here to the studio. And the only way really to put the paint into that carved stone is by hand. There just aren't other techniques that really allow for that rather odd and difficult way of painting. So I hired a couple of painters, and for a couple of years they've been painting these images into the carved stone. So I hope that sort of describes a little bit the way that I go about working.
Well, that kind of opens door to the conversation about your interest in anthropology and how other cultures represent the human form. And so, can you tell me a little more about, because I know that you had a strong interest in anthropology, going all the way back to school, and maybe how that kind of unlocked some things in your creative process in terms of where you get some inspirations from around the world.
Yeah, I do notice that. I collect quite a lot of art myself, and obviously look at a lot of art. And 90% of the art that I collect seems to be of people. I'm not really quite sure why that is, and it may be that if you totted up the entirety of art in existence, that 90% of it is of people. Probably, if you extended that to people and other animals, I think that might be true. I do spend a great deal of my time depicting humans myself. I do often stop and wonder why and how can I get away from doing that. I've got a project at the moment to draw toddlers, which is one way of sort of shifting within that, but to somewhere slightly else. And I do draw a lot of animals, non-human animals as well. But there's something, perhaps that's really what we're interested in as humans in the end. We're interested in space and we're interested in architecture, but is it arguable that we're interested in those things insofar as they affect humans and house humans and challenge humans and offer humans places to go? I think that we are quite self-reflective animals, and culture has often reflects that, even if you go back to the earliest recorded existing artworks that we know about. Although interestingly, actually, it was mostly animals that were drawn on cave walls and under boulders until a certain point where you get images of hunters creeping into that discussion. So when you say you're interested in anthropology, yes, it's got a name, but really I'm just interested in people, and in what they do and how they see and how they interpret the world and how they navigate the world and use our vision and our brains and our various senses in order to exist in the world, and how that relates to consciousness and a sense of existence, and therefore communication. So that ends up, why would you just look at now or just look at post-war? That makes no sense to me. If you find images carved on the desert walls in Egypt that were made some 4,000 years ago, it seems just as sensible and normal to get excited and challenged and interested in that. In fact, in some ways, I feel that the distance opens up a lot of things for me. The feeling that that's not, these are people who lived in a world that wasn't dealing with all the same things that I'm dealing with, gives me a kind of a broader interest, perhaps, in those things. I'm not articulating that terribly well. I'm sitting here on a sofa in front of, or just below, really, 5 statues from Vietnam, from the Jorai tribe, who live in Highland, Vietnam. And they're images of crouching humans that used to be in the jungle around perhaps a tomb, showing kind of ancestor figures. And I've not been to Vietnam, and I've certainly not been to the Highland jungle of Vietnam. And yet they make these things make a lot of sense to me at the same time as being quite distant and strange. And they've affected a lot the way that I've been drawing these stainless steel sculptures that I mentioned before, and the idea of these bent limbs and kind of crouching figures excited me a lot. So for me, making art is a lot to do with gathering. It's a lot to do with gathering what I see around me on the high street, in the airport, in museums, even on the internet, reading books. It's all about gathering. I don't feel it's an inward journey so much as an outward scavenging and gathering of information, of images, of things that excite me in the world, and then bringing them back to the studio, bringing them back to my computer and playing with them, seeing what could be done, how I could use some of these things, almost perhaps like cooking, where you go out and gather your materials to cook, and then you bring them back and see what you can make of them.
But, it seems like there is something there about curating or filtering out things till you find that thing that excites you or feels uncannily familiar, right? Like you were talking about the pipe sculptures in your new show that, they're all in these different poses. Some are reclined. And one of the ones that I saw reminded me a lot of how my grandfather would recline on the floor to watch television. It's not that I would look at that and say, "Oh, that's my grandfather," but just the pose, the way the form was holding itself was very familiar, right?
Yeah, I think that I am looking for the way that things are. I'm not looking to impact or to change or to even interpret very much, but to try to capture that sense of what it feels like to look at things, to see things, to be in a space. And what I actually use to make that happen, in some senses, is kind of irrelevant. I draw people from all over the world, and quite often I'll draw people at the place I'm going to do the show next, because it doesn't matter to me whether they're Icelandic or South Korean. What matters is how I could then manipulate it and then use it. So when I was walking around parks during the COVID period and everybody was out in the summer parks in small gatherings of groups, I saw something there which felt really familiar. You could sort of feel yourself into the poses of all these people sitting on the ground, but they also made these fantastic articulated drawings in space of these, obviously there are skeletons inside those bodies, and our bodies work in certain ways with the bones leaning and twisting in very familiar ways. So I didn't want to tell anybody what position to take up. What I wanted to do was to surreptitiously photograph the way that people classically do lie down. And I think there's a kind of joy in that sense of recognition, even though I put that information through a whole load of processes of 3D scanning models in my studio and then getting bicycle factories to build those out of tubing. You still get that kind of almost like the smell of something that brings you immediately to that familiarity of how people collapse on the floor and read a book or look at their phone leaning against a wall. You can feel yourself in that. You can feel the familiarity of that. And I think that kind of, it's a difficult thing to locate. I can only locate it by playing around, by trying all sorts of different possibilities, by testing and rejecting and accepting. I don't have a set formula. I just keep pushing it around, trying different materials, different colors, different surfaces, different scales, until something has that real sense of reality. I think trying to kind of locate that sense of what feels real. I don't know if you ever get this sensation when you're like falling asleep and you just, maybe even your eyes are shut or they're open, but you just get a sense of the world around you being so familiar, almost like the inside of the top of the roof of your mouth with your tongue. It's like you can't see it, but you know what it feels like. It's such a familiar thing. It's almost like your own smell. And it's that sense of attachment and drawing of the world around you that I'm looking for.
You mentioned there how you will analyze movement, you'll record how people move in these different spaces around the world. And you were talking about, including movement of people that are specific to where you're doing shows. Do you notice that people move differently in these different locations? Is there a different pace? Do people hold themselves different? Does it allow the people in the areas where those shows are to more easily find that familiar connection that we're talking about?
I think that is true. It's a complicated issue, I think, because there's a perhaps not 100% appealing quality of humans to like to see themselves reflected in everything rather than anything strange or unknown. Is that unappealing? I'm not sure. I often am surprised that people in far away places would rather, seemingly to me, rather see images of the familiar, of buildings that come from where they live and people that are dressed and the same as what they are. You think in a way that one might want to see the opposite. And I think that there is that element too. It's not a dead set thing, but there's a sense of people feeling quite comfortable, I think, or feeling pleased by the idea of seeing themselves, really. That maybe not specifically themselves, but sort of themselves in a broader sense. And I'm not sure what that means. I play to it. On the other hand, I'm showing at the moment in London some of the people from a recent project I did photographing people in Busan in South Korea. And that seems to be going fine. In terms of your question as to differences, I certainly notice differences in dress, and obviously people in Boston dress very differently from people in Mumbai, and it leads to a very different painting. And I play that up, in terms of the background color. I'll think of a color that for me kind of symbolizes walking around Mumbai. And likewise, Boston, and I kind of enjoy and celebrate the sense that in the winter everybody's got coats on, and that in terms of the composition of the paintings, you get this very pumping kind of imagery of big coats and bags pushing out at the edges of the canvas and pushing against each other. There's not much space in between. Whereas if you photograph people in Melbourne during the summer, everybody's got flip flops and shorts on. Right. And so the painting kind of opens out. There's a lot more space in between the limbs, and there's a lot more flesh color. And I like that sense. I think Andy Warhol said that if you've got to make a decision, something's wrong. And I like the sense that the color scheme it's not my decision. It's what people wear in Boston. It's not my decision. It's the color of the people that are walking down the beach front in Melbourne. And therefore I can allow the logics of the works to come out of the situation that I'm drawing. So for a long time I felt, okay, I should go around the world and draw everybody, every city, every place, every weather part of the world that I could come across. I did do that to a degree. Obviously that's a pretty large project. But then recently I was noticing that over the year of working that just at the end of my street, there was this amazing palette that I was slightly missing out on of the changing seasons and the times of day and the weather. So when it's raining, you get a completely different sort of composition and type of movement, and you got all the umbrellas, and it's kind of it's a gift, like great. Here's a whole other set of works that could be made, and then come the spring, you've got a different kind of movement again. So I've followed that through for quite a while, and then it occurs to me that different sizes of people is also really interesting. It's a kind of endless project that I can only nibble at the edges of, depending on what shows I've got coming up and what materials I want to use and what seems to fit together.
You have in the past set up cameras and record people moving across streets out in the wild. But there are times when you've asked people to come in and let you capture their movement as they're walking on a treadmill. Can you see a noticeable difference in how people move when they know they're being observed? Or is it a matter of like the portraitists, when they have somebody sitting for them, it's just a matter of time before the person, that model or the subject, settles in to who they really are? Does that question make sense?
It does, and it's a big conversation and something that I think about a great deal. For a while, I was collecting 17th, 18th century portraiture, and you know the kind of thing when you go to a museum and there's a lot of brown canvases with gold frames and people looking out into the space. I've always loved those kind of paintings. I grew up in Oxford, where there's some fantastic museums that have a lot of those paintings hanging in them, like the Ashmolean, famously. And then we come up to London and go and see museums. And I would like to stand in the doorway of the museum rooms rather than actually entering, and just scan the entire room and see these golden framed rectangles of brown, and all these people kind of gazing out from the past and history into the space. If you think about it, those paintings were probably hung in quite dark rooms. They didn't have electric lights and candles. They would have been very present as humans in the space, perhaps with an equal sense of presence to the real people in that space. And there's a very strong sense that that's the purpose of those works, was presence, and that generally those people are looking at you. They were painted, you know, with the people sitting in front of the artist over a period of weeks or months, and generally that you can feel the relationship between the artist and the sitter, and then you become, you know, the artist in a way, because you're the audience in the position of where the artist was standing in the first place. And there's that sense of being looked at, looking at the person, looking at the El Greco, looking back at you. It's a very powerful, sometimes uncanny quality. Compare that to an Egyptian figure drawn from the side, striding past you. They don't care about you. You're like a kind of, you hardly exist. You're a lucky audience that gets to glimpse this image of activity, of life. And I like both of those routes, and I've used them greatly. I've gone deeply into portraiture of people looking straight at you and posing in order to reflect and push their sense of themselves out to you. But I'm not really doing that so much these days. I'm tending to be more interested in that second category I described, where you're kind of looking onto the world, you're looking onto activities of people who are going about their daily business. They're doing what they're doing. They're not in relationship to you whatsoever. And in that sense, the street is a much more viable and interesting undertaking. So I've stopped taking commissions for portraits. I don't really want people knowing that I'm looking at them, and quite often we'll sort of hide the camera on a traffic island, and we don't. When I say we, I get other people to do it as well as myself, especially because I can't travel all over the world to do this, especially in recent times. So I get them not to put the camera up to their head, but to put them in kind of waist height and pretend that they're really busy looking at their phone or something, so that these photographs are somewhat surreptitious. It's legal. I've looked it up. That gives me back thousands of photographs of an endless palette of one, and everybody is amazing. You've probably felt that too as you sit on the underground and look at the people opposite you. Everybody is like, oh, if I could have that person and that person and that person, they're all amazing in their own way. So it's a wonderful palette of possibilities that I can only kind of take a tiny percentage of back to the studio and work with. Having said that, it's actually really difficult to make a decent animation of someone on the street, because people are going up and down the pavements, they're leaning, they are wiggling around the people coming the other way, their heads are looking around. It's extremely technically difficult to get much great footage off the street. So as a compromise, what I often will do is to usually use my wife and daughter, who are very sociable, to stand on the doorstep of my studio and pay people £50 notes and get them to quickly sign a disclaimer and come into the studio. So I feel like they're fresh off the street. They've got all their street clothes on. They're not dressed to my demands, but I can control them and I can get them onto the walking machine, tell them to either take the coat off or not, or put their bag down or not. I can't draw people with rucksacks, and about 50% of people in the world wear rucksacks. And it's really not a fun thing to draw.
Right.
It's kind of floppy and shapeless and usually black. So getting them to take those off really helps. And then I get some really good footage. But the loss is that I've lost that smell of the street. on the street they might be holding a coffee cup, and I can't get them to hold a coffee cup. That would feel too self-conscious. I can't go and buy a coffee and say, "Could you hold this?"
Right.
No, I don't know why. What would I get? A cigarette, a coffee cup, a mobile phone. I'd much rather just use what I see coming from the world. So if you see an image of mine that's quite stripped down, in the sense that they haven't got anything in their hands and they don't have any bag and stuff, it's quite likely that would have been drawn in the studio. But there are advantages to that. I can make a much cleaner composition without all that paraphernalia. Additionally, so for some projects, it makes sense to have people in the studio. I still tend to use strangers, but I can use friends and family if necessary. I am working on a work at the moment, which may or may not actually function for the next show, where I'm going to use real people in the exhibition. They can obviously going to have to be sort of volunteers or paid volunteers, or members of students or something who'll come and function within. So if you can imagine a painting where instead of me drawing people and putting those people into the painting of people walking, I'll actually just have people walking, and I'll put them on walking machines and have a rectangular square or rectangle of color behind them, and then compose these walking figures in front of the painting. And then if anybody coming to visit the exhibition wants to join in and be in the painting, they can step up and take over from that. That's the plan anyway. It's an ambitious plan. I'm not quite sure how sensible it is or even feasible, but it just seemed like a logical step in a way, because all I'm doing really is taking images of the people on the street, almost like stealing their shadows and putting those into compositions and paintings. So why not take the actual person?
It makes me think that it's even more possible today in terms of how technology is evolving, instead of rotoscoping, to be able to do motion capture, right? Is that something that you've considered, moving to actually having those sensors or reference spots on someone and kind of constructing that digitally versus rotoscoping, or is that already part of your process?
I don't really rotoscope. I do 3D scan. It's a very neat way of getting very good material into the computer to work with. Photographing is problematic when you want to get a lot of three-dimensional information into a program where you can manipulate it and use it, because the photograph distorts so much, whereas a 3D scan you can either put distortion in or take it out. So for those stainless steel images that I was talking about earlier, those were 3D scanned because the photographs were useless. If you take a photograph of someone from down low near their feet, they appear to have enormous feet, obviously. And that's very unuseful for trying to make a sculpture. You can't measure. So we were measuring the feet and measuring the limbs, and it was all getting very complicated, whereas the 3D scan, perfect, I've got it all. I'm somewhat resistant to getting too involved in very high-tech rotoscoping and scanning. I don't know, it just slightly exhausts me, and if I can do something in a simple way, I would generally rather. So I animate in a pretty old-school fashion, frame by frame, like Disney or Studio Ghibli or whatever. And it's served me well. I'm not rejecting any other technologies, and I can see that rotoscoping is pretty amazing, and certainly gives you that uncanny sense of bringing the reality of the situation out. I don't really want to dazzle people with technology, though. I think there's a danger of that taking over the experience of the artwork. You're just like, oh my God, gee whiz, that's an amazing that it exists. And that's fun for a while, like fireworks, but it kind of gets a little dull after about 20 minutes. So I'd rather kind of make the technology seem pretty basic and explicable as you look at it, even if it isn't. As we know, often behind some of these what seemingly simple technologies, it's quite complicated. I want it to feel familiar and something that you're quite used to. So that makes me think about the project I'm working on at the moment, which is these virtual reality exhibitions, which I've been making around the world. And I just opened one yesterday here in London. And although that technology is mind-blowing, it's the kind of technology that's built to have self-drive cars and that kind of thing. And I've got no idea how it works really. It actually ends up giving you something that looks quite simple and familiar. In the way that I'm using it, what I do is I ask people to put the goggles on and walk into a normal gallery space. It looks normal. It's actually built by us out of planes on a computer program, but I tend to base it on existing galleries and museums. So it looks like you just walked into another museum or gallery space, and then I present my artworks as if they're also fairly normal and often on plinths or hanging on the wall like a painting. But at that point, I can then go anywhere I want. I can make the statue move. I can make the painting go into 3 dimensions back into the wall. And by going through a little corridor at the back of this 3D environment, this VR environment, when you come back out of the same corridor back into the same space, I can draw it so it appears that you're coming into a new space with different works in it. So all of it's pretty familiar. Going through different gallery spaces in the museum is familiar. Coming across new statues on plinths is familiar. It doesn't feel particularly high tech, but the technology behind being able to make it appear that you're seeing all of that, of course, is very high tech equipment, courtesy of Zuckerberg and Meta.
The virtual reality, like, what is that unlocking for your viewer experience that your normal exhibition wouldn't have? Is it the ability for someone to really get close and interact from angles that they wouldn't normally? Or is it just the ability to do things that you can't do in a normal physical space?
To be honest, I'm actually really not sure. It's something new for me, and I find it very exciting, and I find it very appealing, and appealing in a seductive way as much as anything else. Not dangerous really, but there's a sense of escapism in there, and I have a strong sense of escapism in myself. I like to escape. I like literally escape just off onto journeys, but also mentally escape into books, into films. I don't feel to be an unhappy person in the world, but I also like to escape from it. Maybe I feel like my connection to the world is a mental connection. It's something that I can look at and be slightly distanced from. And therefore, when I'm actually disconnected from the world, that feels as real, or it may be more real than when I'm just functioning in the world. How would I explain that? Sometimes if you're in a public space and then you go to the public lavatories and you lock the door, and suddenly you're in a different kind of space. You know that you're still in that public space and there's throngs of people passing by around you, but the door's locked and you've got this personal small space around you. I don't know if that particularly helps, but I think that the VR is a little bit like that locked lavatory room that you can escape into, that allows you to somehow feel more yourself and feel more a sense of your own existence. So although the virtual reality rooms that I'm presenting there are, they're completely false. Everything that you're looking at doesn't exist at all. There's a kind of hyper reality, a hyper sense of feeling your own presence and your existence. And I think art is very much about that. I think that the first impulse, and I'm making this up as I go along because I've got no idea, of course, but if you think about Homo erectus or Neanderthals or early humans drawing on the wall. I don't think Homo erectus did draw on the wall, but Neanderthals probably did, and certainly early humans did. What are they creating there? What alternate reality are they conjuring up with that drawing, that literally drawing out of the wall and out of their experience in the world, and creating this floating world on the wall? You have to imagine that at best they'd be looking at this in the caves in firelight from the fire, or a torch in their hand, so it wouldn't be brightly lit with clear spotlights. It would be an emerging world that was created out of those drawings. And I think that art is very much about, for me anyway, locating that sense of how we actually exist in the world. It's not that we all exist entirely in our heads, or that we exist entirely out in the tangible materials that are probably in front of us. we exist in a world that's in between those two, and I think art allows us to feel that sense of connection and to feel the falsity, in a sense, of the world. But in that falsity, there's actually how we exist, which is reality. I'm getting a little lost with words there, but I'm trying to sort of explain why when you come into the VR rooms in the galleries that I'm making, that perhaps it's not really a sense of stepping out of reality into an imagined world. It's more trying to conjure up what the world actually is to us. I often think about bats. We think that we see the world. We think that is the world. I'm looking at my studio here, and you must be looking at your office or living room there, and it's real, right? That's what it is. If you walk over there, you can touch it. But if you stop and think about it, what you're actually doing is you're scanning that space, and what you're seeing is bounced light that's upside down on the back of your retinas, and your brain is interpreting rapidly all of that information added to tactile, sensory, smell, a number of other things that we can sense. It's building that space as a model inside your brain, which you then map onto the space that's in front of you. If there's an earthquake or if you have a brain problem, it'll all shift and it won't be quite right anymore, and it'll be very uncanny and unnerving. But it can do that. And if you think about bats, they probably see the same thing that you do, we do. We have bats in a place we rent in France, and why did I say that? I own this place in France. That's weird. Don't say that. Okay, we have a place that we own in France, and it's often full of bats. And in the dark, they can see the space that's around them. And I presume that they also, like you in your office and me in my studio, think that that's reality. But actually, what they're seeing is bounced sound rapidly clicking out of their mouths and back into their ears. So this sense that we know reality, that we see reality, is something that is constructed, and the bats also construct that in their heads, and probably they see in color in some sense. But what would that color mean for them? I imagine perhaps it might mean texture, so that something fluffy looks red and something smooth looks blue. And we think we see color, but actually what we're doing is we're looking at wavelengths. And our brain interprets those wavelengths as color. And I'm not a scientist, but you can imagine how that conversation would go. So, have I explained VR at all there? I'm not quite sure. It excites me a lot because I can see the possibilities there. It scares me because it's such a huge landscape and it sort of realigns everything that I've done, but it feels like it fits. I find myself thinking as I look at the works that I've made over the years, I can imagine how I could use some of these projects in the VR and take them to places that I had felt I couldn't go any further with the actual objects. Of course, you don't have gravity in VR. You can have any material you want. You can make things float without having to stop them falling over or fall to the floor. There's a lot of rules that don't apply. And although I tend not to break them too much because I want to keep that sense of, as you call it, uncanny reality, it's certainly the case that I can make a steel sculpture in VR and make it move, which is pretty hard to do out in the real world, without an awful lot of cogs and mess.
Part of what you've done in the past in terms of creating immersive experiences and also in this VR space is including sounds. I don't know if soundtrack is the right term, but you tend to, at least in these exhibition spaces, have music or sounds that accompany and heighten the viewing experience. And I know you've commissioned a piece of techno dance music to go along with a piece in the VR exhibit. Can you talk a little bit about how sound is a component that you add to your practice to heighten that immersiveness?
Yeah, well, as I explained with the bats, our understanding of our surroundings is built as a highly evolved system, defensive system to exist. And our sense of touch and smell and sound is all there to enhance our ability to deal with the world and to survive, obviously. when it comes to art, I always felt that it was exciting and fun to let go of the presumptions of what an artist did. So, I always felt that at art college that I would poke fun, back in the 80s, that the idea that artists should make paintings. I used to draw with a brush dipped in ink. I would draw canvases on the wall with the nail and the shadow of the nail and the string up to the nail, and like a cartoonist drawing an art exhibition on the wall, but there would be no paintings in these frames. The artwork itself would be the process of, a drawing of art, and that kind of sense of being open to any possibilities in order to create the artwork. It seemed sensible to use whatever senses one might be able to get hold of. In my degree show, I actually went around spraying air freshener every day in the gallery space, as well as having the artworks and a soundtrack in there, just to try to kind of push this idea that you become hyper aware of all of your senses, even if it wasn't the right smell. In that case, and I've not repeated that experiment in terms of smell, because that seems like a step too far to me, really. But I remember doing a series of Japanese landscapes, sort of looking particularly at Hiroshige and Japanese woodblock prints from the 19th century, and I kind of tried to mimic those in a way by driving around Japan and taking photographs and then turning them into animations, where all the elements within the composition would move. So cars would move, birds would fly, water would ripple, all of which is possible now with technology. And I included rain in some of them, as Hiroshige often famously would have rain across the image of the landscape. And it's actually quite difficult to draw rain. It's quite, what do you see? Do you see black lines as Hiroshige would draw? Not really. But do you see white lines? Well, kind of not really either. And are they dotted, and how fast do they move? And I struggled with this for quite a while. And then I recorded some rain sounds and put them in, and it looked like rain. It didn't matter what you did. You could do black lines, white lines, red lines. Just your brain immediately said rain. And you can see that when you watch cartoons or even just normal TV and turn the sound off. The reality level drops, by 50%. It's that sense of the sound coming off something is so much part of our understanding and reading of the world. So that seems like a kind of an obvious thing, but not for every project. Some works it's kind of a relief just to leave them as they are. But certainly when I was looking at this dance project, it seemed like a dance movement without music is, you'd have to say, I don't know, toast without butter, or one of those phrases about beef without mustard. It looks really weird if someone's dancing without music, and it seemed almost like it actually had to be. It's not the easiest thing to add sound to artworks. It drives the gallery people mad to have that sound playing 24/7 for a month, and for collectors or museums, it's not entirely easy to have that sound. It sounds very intrusive. You can't turn it off by turning away from sound. It's still there. So it's a difficult thing to use, much more difficult than an image in many ways. But I personally have sound on most of the time when I'm working, and I quite often have repeated sound. My family teases me about the fact that I sit there listening to CDs of rain sounds or spa music or wind chimes. I like the idea of music that has no beginning and no end, just sound. I find that very calming and engaging. I think of Warhol's films where Sleep and Eat and his portraits, where there isn't really a beginning or an end or a narrative. It just is. It's just there. It's movement. It's a moving image, but it's not a story. It's not a film. I've always approached films in that way. My films, artworks, they don't have a beginning or an end. And they're often even not looped. It's possible with computers to have algorithms where it simply keeps making decisions. So, for instance, I'll draw a crowd of people walking, and one person will come into the screen, another person will leave, and they'll crisscross. And it's not a loop. It's an algorithm which just tells randomly the group of people who are waiting on the side of the painting figure A, move across, and then figure B, move across, but back the other way, and then figure B, be in front of figure A, and then another algorithm will say, okay, now figure A, be in front of figure B. And so I end up with this composition, which is it's endless, and it's a film, but it's got no beginning or end or story. And I like the sound to function in the same way, so that became necessary to actually commission musicians to make me sound loops. And I've sort of been lucky over the years to bump into musicians for one reason or another. So Brian Adams wrote me a small guitar riff that is on a loop that sits behind some paintings of him playing the guitar and uses the surface of the painting as a loudspeaker. You can get speakers like that just make the whole thing vibrate. And then I worked with a musician called Max Richter, who's a really great contemporary classical musician who writes a lot of film soundtracks. And I did an album cover for him, and in return, he wrote me a little piece of music, which I've used in a similar way. For this dance project, I really needed to manipulate things much more than simply asking someone for a piece of music. So I used a young musician called Archie Wingate, and we looked at and listened to a lot of dance music from the appropriate era, which kind of 2010s, and I got him to amalgamate and play with some of those themes and sounds and make these soundtracks rather than songs, because they have no beginning or end. They run continuously and they're in time with the dancing figures, so that you get a kind of full experience painting. It's moving, the music's emanating from the surface of the painting, which is actually an LED screen, but it's hung on the wall like a painting.
Julian, I really appreciate your time today. The current show is up at Lisson Gallery from, I guess, last night or today.
Yeah. The opening was last night, so it's very fresh. Just going to say that the one thing with VR, that the way that I use it is, VR can function in a number of different ways, and the way that most people use it for gaming is to have two hand controls that allow you to move through space. But it's not as realistic, because your body isn't actually moving through that space. It's just your eyes and your head, your mind that moves through the visual environment. It's exciting and it's great, and I love it, but it does make you feel a little sick. And the reality level is medium. What I do is put those paddles, what they call paddles, away, and just put the goggles on and just invite people to enter a 9 by 5 meter space that's got 1.50 meter high walls, and just to wander around this space. You don't need to do anything. You don't need to press buttons or find keys, or you just need to go through the back corridor that says exhibition continues into another room, and that's all you really need to do. Do that repeatedly. And the only way that I know how to do that at the moment is that you do it on your own. You experience the entire experience on your own. You're in an empty gallery, maybe after hours. And that means that although I've got 2 spaces there, I can only get through 2 people every 10 minutes or so. So that's a kind of inherent limitation to the project. And it means that you kind of got to book a time slot. So if you go online, you can book a time slot. If you turn up, you'll probably get in there anyway. People seem to spend about 8 minutes or so on average in the space. So that kind of leaves a bit of extra flexibility. But it does mean that, for instance, in this show in Busan, and I've built 4 of the booths in that site, because that allows me, to put 4 people through every 10 minutes and therefore increase the flow, because I hate queuing for artworks. I really resent it. I end up feeling like, the experience was more about queuing than it was about the artwork. But, what can you do? At the moment, that's where the technology is. And I also quite like the idea and the feeling of being on your own, in that sense of going into the laboratory and locking the door. It's got that feeling that you've left the space that you came into off the street, and you're kind of entering this quite mental, personal space, and therefore being on your own sort of increases that for the time being. So I would just add that. So if you're going to come to London, I hope you will, and see the show, might be wise to book a time slot.
Again, Julian, I really appreciate you opening up and telling us about your motivations and what's in your head and how that winds up producing work that really makes us stop and consider and think that there's this note of familiarity and sentimentality to a lot of what we find in your work. And I really appreciate you giving me the opportunity to spend the hour with you.
Well, thank you very much. Bear in mind that we had the opening last night and stayed up till 1 post-show party, so my articulation is not at its highest, but I hope I kind of managed to explain a little bit about how I go about thinking.
No, it was great. That's all the time we have for this week. You've been listening to Art Sense. You can find the show on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. If you've enjoyed this podcast, be sure to subscribe. And while you're there, please rate the show and leave a quick review. Your feedback is the key to other folks finding us. And if you'd like to see images related to the conversation, read the transcript, and find other bonus features, you can go to cambia.art and click on the podcast tab. If you'd like to reach out to me, you can email me at craig@cambia.art. Thanks for listening.